Welcome to an explosive edition of Experimental, in which we snack with the Japanese and dunk with the Australians. In a moment, we'll be reading by microwave and using mint to avoid a nasty accident. But first, feeling peckish? Midnight snacking, one of life's great guilty pleasures. Sushi rolls, cold noodles and cream cakes. There's nothing better for holding off those troublesome nighttime hunger pangs. But like most guilty pleasures, there's a payoff. And amazingly, the amount of weight we put on here may have as much to do with when we eat as what we eat. Studies have shown that when workers move to night shifts, they put on weight, even though they don't change the sort of food they eat. It's also been shown that the later at night we eat, the more likely it is that our bodies will convert the food to fat. So what's going on? Well, Dr. Shimba from Nihon University thinks he may have found the answer, with a little help from his furry friends and their little fat bellies.
At the moment, not only in Japan but throughout the rest of the world, there's a bit of a problem with lifestyle diseases such as diabetes and arteriosclerosis, which are caused by obesity. I wanted to know more about obesity, and that's why I started my research.
Dr. Shimba was interested in a protein called BMAL1 that's thought to control our body's biological clock. It's found in high concentrations in our tissues when we're asleep, but starts to disappear as soon as we wake up. BMAL1 had already been shown to be involved with things like body temperature and hormone levels. But Dr. Shimba wanted to know if it played a role in turning sushi rolls into tummy rolls. He took cell cultures of fat-producing tissue that had been genetically engineered so that it couldn't produce BMAL1. Amazingly, without this body clock protein, they were unable to produce any fat at all.
At the
time, it was already known that BMAL1 adjusts the body's biological clock, so I thought that eating at night might be linked to getting fat.
We wanted Dr. Shimba to put his money where his mouth is and prove that the biological clock affects fat production. Thankfully, he had a ready-made experiment up his sleeve. Taking identical sets of mice, he fed one group during the night when their BMAL1 levels are at their highest, and the other group during the middle of the day, when their BMAL1 levels are lowest. But after just 3 days on this regime, would we see any difference between the mice? Well, the first set, fed during the day, weighed in at 35 grams. A perfectly slim, trim, healthy weight for a growing squeaker. And now for the mice fed at night. They were given exactly the same amount of food, but would their sleepy time snacking have an effect on their furry waistline? Yes, 40 grams, a 15% weight increase in just 3 days by simply changing their meal times. So mice get fat if they eat when their biological clock thinks they should be asleep. And it makes a lot of sense. When they're active, the mice need to make energy from food immediately available to power their little legs and twitchy noses. But when they should be asleep, the presence of BMAL1 switches their fat cells into overdrive, and the food energy is stored away as fat for later emergency use. The really interesting thing about protein BMAL1 is that we have it too. and its levels are 20% higher in the middle of the night, when we should be asleep, than in the middle of the day. So does this mean that the fat-inducing power of midnight snacking is finally solved?
As for human beings, the experiments have only just started. In the future, I would like to do further research. I would like to study BMAL1 in obese people and people who have a strong tendency to eat at night.
Before we head off to Wales to catch the common cold, how about blowing up the test department? Have you ever played with water balloons and marvelled at their suggestively squidgy nature? Well, don't. You should be doing something healthy, like making them into bombs. Thank you, Horace. That's better. Test tubes, water, battery are electrolysis. Real physics at last. What we're doing is using the wonders of electricity to split H2O into H and O. What the electricity does is split the water molecule apart. The oxygen atoms are being attracted to the positive wire, whilst the hydrogen atoms are attracted to the negative wire. Do this enough, and you could collect enough hydrogen to fill a balloon. Then you could do some grown-up, don't do this at home type science by assessing its volatility, like this.
Do not try this at home. It's completely irresponsible and very dangerous.
In a moment, there'll be a chance to get over all that excitement with tea and biscuits, experimental style. But first, let's cool ourselves down in Wales. Each year, billions of people across the world suffer from the common cold. If you believe most mothers, catching a cold is all to do with how we dress.
Oh, my mum always used to say you wrap up warm.
I wrap up warm.
Wrap warm.
You wrap up warm.
Put many layers on.
Wear lots of clothes, never go out with wet hair, because if I did, then, you know, I would catch pneumonia and probably die.
But doctors have always insisted that catching a cold has nothing to do with being cold. So who's right? The mothers or the doctors? Well, a recent study at Cardiff University has revealed that mother may have been right after all. It was carried out at the Centre for the Common Cold, and the man in charge was Professor Ron Eccles.
A couple of thousand years ago, everyone believed that cold weather was the cause of common cold. I think at the beginning of the 20th century, up until 1950 or so, we got the discovery of viruses. That was the solution for science. Everything to do with common cold was associated with viruses.
Buoyed by the discovery of viruses, scientists in the 1950s and 60s carried out two seminal studies, which concluded that catching a cold was everything to do with viruses, and nothing to do with chilling flesh. The results have stood for over 50 years, and still appear in modern textbooks, but Ron wasn't sure they were right.
There was only perhaps half a dozen or a dozen people in each group. These are far too small numbers for any proper statistical comparison.
Ron designed a new experiment that was bigger, better and more natural. He increased the number of subjects to over 180. He got half of them to dunk their feet in buckets of cold water.
It's cold.
While the other half maintained toasty, well-wrapped toes. Then, rather than administering a virus, he simply waited for nature to take its course.
Within the chilled group, 13 out of 90 developed colds over the next 4 or 5 days after chilling, whereas only 5 out of 90 developed colds in the control group. This was a highly significant difference between the two groups.
What a result! 50 years of supposedly scientific fact blown clear out of the water. But what was going on? Why on earth were the group with cold feet more likely to catch a cold? The answer, rather surprisingly, is all to do with the nose. The main function of the nose is to warm up the air we breathe before it enters the lungs. The body achieves this with ingenious plumbing. It diverts hot blood to the lining of the nose, which acts like a radiator, heating up the cold air on the way in. But in really cold weather, the body switches to survival mode and diverts the blood away from the nose to the centre of the body to prevent heat loss. And that's great news for the common cold virus. It lives inside the nose, where it fights a running battle with white blood cells, the foot soldiers of our immune system. These cells are carried to the battleground in the bloodstream. So when cold weather shuts off the blood, it also weakens our defences.
The chilling causes constriction of the blood vessels. This reduces the supply of white cells and allows the virus that extra foothold to replicate and to grow inside the nose and to create those nasty symptoms of blocked nose, runny nose and sneezing that we're all so familiar with when we get a common cold. For a long time, mothers have been telling their children to wrap up, and children can retort, well, scientists say there's no link between colds and chilling. But now we've got this support.
Ron wants to do more experiments to check that his hypothesis is indeed correct. But until then, it pays to remember that Mother really does know best.
Don't try this at home.
Before we head down under to grind up some biscuits, let's head to the test department for some thirst-quenching advice. The humble bottle has a habit of making even mild-mannered people, like our test department demonstrators, into seething angry wrecks. But if you're in a rush for a refreshing beverage, don't let bottle rage get you down. Here's the test department's top tip for emptying a bottle in the fastest time. Welcome to the Test Department Wine Tasting Club. Our wine buffs are interested in a good nose and an intriguing palate. But most importantly, they're interested in how quickly they can get the stuff into their glass. As well as arguing over their favourite tipple, the three demonstrators also have different opinions on the quickest way to empty them. So let's find out whose method is the fastest. Demonstrator 1 will hold the bottle upside down. Demonstrator 2 will tilt it at an angle, and Demonstrator 3 will tilt and twirl at the same time. Here goes. What's important in getting liquid out of a bottle is how fast you can replace it with air. Twisting the bottle creates a vortex, quite literally a pipe, through which the air can rush in whilst the liquid rushes out. So next time you want some wine in a hurry, give it a twirl. In a moment, two pedestrians try and save themselves with mint. And we bring a light bulb back from the grave with the aid of a microwave. But first, some physics. Australians love to dunk, especially when they've got a cup of tea and a biscuit. The problem is, they don't always get it right. To help them, Experimental went in search of physicist Len Fisher, a scientist on a mission to rewrite the rulebook on biscuit dunking and perfect the perfect plunge.
The whole point about dunking is that it releases the flavour of the biscuit, up to 10 times what you get from a dry biscuit. But one of the problems with dunking is if you dunk for too long, you end up with no biscuit at all.
As all dunkers know, mistime a dunk and you face catastrophic biscuit collapse and a mug full of sludge. So can we have our dunk biscuit and eat it? Len set out to test the strength of a biscuit by applying the force of apples.
It's very nice because we measure force in newtons as physicists, and a newton very closely is the force of gravity on an average size apple. Let's just see if we can get... That is a 3 Newton biscuit already. Let's just see if we can make him into a 4 Newton biscuit. He's very... OK, that was very close to a 4 Newton biscuit. They're strong.
So a dry biscuit is very strong. But what happens when it gets wet?
I wonder what it'll do if it's got a force of a Newton on it. I think we've proved our point, haven't we?
You'd have thought that Len's apple experiments would have been enough to keep him happy, but no. He wanted to find out just how fast a biscuit gets soggy, an experiment requiring some pretty butch tools.
So let's see if we can do it really quickly. 1, 2, and let's see what we got there. And you can see that even in that speed, about 2 seconds, you've got the wet down the outside and the centre has stayed nice and dry. We'll try that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Speed it up again. See how that went. And you see that soaked right through, fallen to bits. 4 seconds and it's gone right to the middle. 2 seconds perfect, 4 seconds terrible.
Hours of research and thousands of biscuits later, Len had worked out the ideal standard dunking time for pretty much every biscuit on the market. But he wasn't finished there. He wanted to find a way of extending the dunking time and help ensure a perfect dunk. Took a while, but after some clever analysis of the way tea travels through a biscuit, he discovered that if the tea only entered the biscuit from one side, it would take up to 4 times as long to travel all the way through, which led Len to a whole new way of dunking biscuits.
Instead of putting it straight in like that, lay it across the top. Because you're only wetting one side, takes 4 times as long to get through, plenty of time, you can watch. As long as the top stays dry, the biscuit won't fall in. And furthermore, if you get a chocolate-coated biscuit, the chocolate doesn't melt. Simple.
Ah, but will it work in the real world? Experimental had to know whether the Len Fisher one-sided technique would work with your average dunker in the street. To find out, we booked 2 tables in a local tea house. On the left, we monitored a variety of dunkers using the traditional both-side technique.
OK, guys, now this is the scientific way to dunk a biscuit.
Whilst dunkers on the right-hand table got one-sided instructions from the great man himself.
There.
And within a few dunks, it looks like the traditional immersion eaters are indeed dropping like Len has predicted. Whilst on the right, those instructed on the one-sided dunk technique seem to be suffering no drop-off at all. After a couple of hours of non-stop dunking using a random selection of Antipodean wetters, the results are obvious. The Len Fisher one-sided dunk system really does work, just like the great physicist said it would. Still to come on Experimental, how to drive with your nose. But first, to the test department. Over at the test department, it's evening, and our demonstrator is relaxing with a glass of adult fruit juice and some light-hearted reading material. Wouldn't you know it, just as he settled down, the light bulb blows, leaving our unfortunate demonstrator in the dark. But at the test department, we have a saying: waste not, want not. You see, even a seriously dead light bulb can be resurrected using a microwave oven. Just stick it in and hit the on button, and bingo! Your once dead light bulb is glowing brighter than ever before. But how is this possible? Well, before its demise, our light bulb worked when electricity flowed through a thin wire called a filament, which heated up and emitted light. It came to the end of its first life when the filament broke, and the electricity stopped flowing. In the microwave, the filament is heated not by electricity flowing through it, but by microwaves. So the fact that the filament is broken makes no difference. There's one thing our demonstrator has forgotten though. Microwaves heat up the element so much that eventually the whole bulb explodes. So it looks like an early bed after all.
I should think so. What you just saw was incredibly dangerous. You must not, repeat, not try this at home. Oh.
Driving, one of life's great pleasures. Open road, howl of the engine, the wind in your hair. But driving safely requires skill, concentration, alertness, and mint. Peppermint, to be precise. Experimental psychologists Charles Spence and Christy Ho have been researching new and unusual ways of improving car safety. Believe it or not, peppermint could be the key. You see, most safety devices rely on two of our senses to work: sight and sound. But we've got 5 senses, each with their own dedicated bit of the brain. So perhaps when sight and hearing are tied up trying to make sense of the dials or working out where the bass on the stereo should be, the others could be used to keep us on the road. To test some of their ideas, Charles and Christy called an old friend, Dr. Nick Reed, at the Transport Research Laboratories in Berkshire near London. TRL's state-of-the-art 3D simulator was perfect for testing out their stimulating ideas. It throws up common danger scenarios, like the car up front suddenly braking. The first sense to be added to the standard 2 was touch, courtesy of these little vibrating pads. Before you ask, they go on the seat belt.
What we had were 2 sort of vibrators, one on the driver's front and one on their back. And at various points in the experiment, the car in front would suddenly brake, and you'd have to brake as rapidly as you could. And there we'd compare how quickly the drivers could actually put their foot on the brake pedal when there was no vibration, which would be kind of the typical road driving situation, versus with these vibrotactile warnings, where if the car in front suddenly braked, you'd feel a vibration on your stomach, and if the car behind you on the road was getting too close, you might feel a vibration on your back.
The tactile warning signals given by the pads improve drivers' reaction times by as much as 0.4 of a second, enough to reduce collisions by up to 50%. Smashing, or not, as the case may be. But if you're going to exploit touch, why not smell as well? And for that matter, which smell would work best? After many tests, Charles and Christy came up with this: peppermint essence. The idea is that rather than the car's sensors delivering a zap to a vibrating pad, they deliver a little puff of strong peppermint odour. Now, when the red lights flashed, the car instantly fills with a minty whiff. And amazingly, drivers planted their foot on the brake around 10% faster than when relying on their eyes alone.
Different smells have different effects upon us, and some smells are kind of very alerting or arousing, like peppermint or citrus or lemongrass are very effective in kind of making people more alert and awake. And the other extreme, you can see cases where drivers sort of getting very aggressive or stressed, or sort of examples of road rage. And in that situation, again, you could think about using calming odours to help relax the driver and diffuse the situation. Things like lavender.
So next time you're heading out in the car, make sure you minimise your distractions. Put the sat-nav away, switch off your mobile phone, but most importantly, trade in that pine fresh car scent for something a little more stimulating.